We're live. All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Ruby Rogues podcast. I'm your host today, Valentino Stoll. I'm joined by co-host Ayush.
Hey.
And we have a very special guest today, Peter Ohler. Peter, why don't you introduce yourself? Maybe tell us a little bit about how you're so great in the Ruby community and all the lovely stuff you're working on.
I don't know if I can claim greatness, but I started with Ruby quite a while ago, early 2012, somewhere maybe 2011. I was over in Japan, started working for a company, KVH, and we were starting to put together uh, a web offering, and decided the best way to, or the best language would be Ruby. So we started on that, and I found out that, well, first of all, that the JSON parser was really slow. So I wrote a JSON parser that was a bit faster. And years later, after leaving Japan, I decided that it would be a good idea to make a more high performance web server, and also stick in GraphQL, which had started to become popular at the time, and the Ruby offering was pretty pitiful, actually. So I tried to make something that was easier to use and higher performance, and that's Agoo.
So real quick, just when you say JSON parser, you mean the OJ gem, right?
Yes, exactly.
I think it's very popular, and has kind of come the de facto, at least in my opinion, of which JSON parser to use for its speed and performance. So I think that's good to clarify. So I'm super interested in this Agoo web server. It is a web server, right? Like
It
that's
is a web
its
server.
purpose. Pretty
Yeah.
awesome. So you have a ton of benchmarks on here, which is kind of incredible. Do you want to just kind of like walk us through the high level, like why use this over, even Sinatra or something like that?
Right. Well, I mean, Sinatra's been around a long time, and it works fine, but its focus wasn't so much on performance as it was on maybe ease of use, or getting things to work, because it was an early system. It's all written in Ruby, which, it's great writing Ruby. I like writing Ruby, but if you're going to go for performance, you need to make a C extension to, you know, to get all you can out of it. And that's part of the reason that Agoo came about. So in terms of Sinatra, uh, works great. If you want a bit higher performance, then Agoo is probably the way. If you're going GraphQL, I would definitely suggest Agoo, just because the current offering with Ruby for GraphQL is much harder to work with. With Agoo, all you have to do is basically say, "Hey, here's my class." As long as it implements the appropriate method, then you're off and running.
Honestly, I really love this use case.
Like
I've been
GraphQL.
looking, yeah, GraphQL. I've been looking for like just drop in, hey, I want to use GraphQL and Ruby, and there's like you can use it in a Rails context with GraphQL Ruby gem. Is that what this is using under the hood, or is it like a
No,
custom implementation?
it's custom implementation.
That's
Yeah,
awesome.
all written in C.
Yeah, so this is super appealing to me. I'm gonna have to give this a try. What what sparked kind of like are you like GraphQL, like we should use this for most things, or what sparked the
I
need to start here?
um, In my work, I started to use GraphQL, and again found most of the implementations, the APIs are very clunky, harder to use. So I wrote something for Agoo, and I also wrote something for Go. Both I'll try to make it as easy to use as possible. Again, not not requiring a whole lot of wrappers and build up, but basically just pointed at the class you're interested in exposing as a GraphQL object and let it run its course. And that was kind of the approach. I wanted something that I could use that was easier to use.
And Agoo is rack compliant, right? So you can use it with any rack app.
Yes, exactly.
Cool.
It actually has some other features as well. As you might be aware, GraphQL also does push. And we were trying to, myself and another fellow, we're trying to get, a API update the specification for Rack to support that without much success. We went back and forth a number of times, and there were enough people that were not interested in seeing that or didn't want to have the API extended that it never made it. But it's available in Agoo.
That's awesome. I mean, I was looking at the some of the documentation here on the GraphQL stuff, and it seems to support subscriptions, which is really interesting.
Yes, that's what I was referring to on the
Yeah,
push.
so I gotcha. So, like, how does I'm curious, for those that don't know, GraphQL subscriptions are a way to kind of stream responses. So how does that kind of work under the hood?
You can use a number of implementations. WebSockets is my preferred choice if you're using a browser. If you're trying to set up an out-of-band subscription, then I typically use something like NATS, which is a messaging system.
And so is the key feature of Agoo, is it high performance or is it GraphQL or is it both?
Yes, it's both.
Okay.
High performance and easy to use GraphQL.
Cool. So like if I was approaching it like an idiot and say that I'm said idiot who builds Rails apps, simple Rails CRUD apps, and I use Puma, what's the reason for me to drop Puma for Agoo, or is that not the right use case for it?
If say that again, maybe I
So
didn't
like,
quite
okay, so
understand it.
I just build Rails apps. I build CRUD Rails apps, and I use Puma as my web server. So if you were explaining it to an idiot, in this case me, what's the reason to drop Puma for Agoo, or is it not the right use case for Agoo?
It depends on the amount of requests you get. If you need something higher performance, then you might go with Agoo. If you wanted to step into the GraphQL world, again, Agoo.
And with Agoo, then I wouldn't need like Nginx or Caddy reverse proxy in front of Puma, I'm guessing, because that's the usual setup with Rails, isn't it? You have a reverse proxy because Puma is not very performant, so you need like a web server in front of it to serve static assets and stuff. But I'm guessing with Agoo, that's not a problem.
That's right. Exactly true. One of the Agoo also does support having multiple workers in separate I was going to say separate threads in separate forked applications. The the advantage of that, of course, is you get around the GVL lock that you have with Ruby, because you can have n number of workers all churning away at the same time. The problem is if you have shared data, then accessing that shared data, typically a database, has overhead in itself, as opposed to having everything in the same process, like within a hash map or something like that. So it's a trade-off, and you have to look at your application to decide. If you are interested in just starting out with GraphQL and want a nice example, I did write a paper for, what was it? App Signal.
Oh, and, okay.
It's called it's a song, application. If you're on the README page for Agoo, you'll see a reference there under the news. It's the second news item. But that kind
Okay,
of
yes, I
walks
see
you
it there.
through it.
Yeah.
I've never seen GraphQL before. I don't know what I'm doing. Here we go. Here's how to do it.
Yep, I see that there. I'll give that a read a bit later on. So what is it that makes Agoo so high performance? Is it just the fact that it's written in C, or is there something something else a bit clever going on?
Of course, there's something more clever going on.
There has to be.
Languages aren't what give you the performance by themselves. What they do is they give you the means to make something faster. So there's less overhead in C than there is in Ruby. That doesn't mean just because you write it in C that it's going to be faster. I've seen plenty of code that's written in C that is abysmally slow. One of the things that Agoo does is it uses multiple threads. Now that's a problem with Ruby because multiple threads means you've got to keep handing over the GVL, which there's overhead in that. With Agoo, what happens is the request comes in, it gets put on a queue. That queue gets picked up by n number of worker threads. They process the request, and it's only when it gets to the very end where it hits the Ruby side again, where it gets the GVL, does the work, gets the response, gives up the lock, and then sends a response back to the requester. So probably 90% of the work is done outside of Ruby.
This reminds me a lot of Shopify's Pitchfork. Are you familiar with that?
I'm not.
No.
I know what Shopify is, but not Pitchfork.
They've been trying to. I think they've actually switched to using this for maybe not for their main monolith, but it's like a forked architecture HTTP server. It sounds a little bit similar.
Yeah, that happens at a different level. With Agoo, it has workers, and those are basically forks of the whole process. But within each one of those forks, there's still multiple threads that are processing the HTTP requests before it basically gets to the Ruby part and says, Ruby part, do your thing, get the response. And then again, it leaves the Ruby part alone and jumps back into multiple threads.
Gotcha. And what are you using for the queuing system?
Oh, I wrote my own. Of course.
Of course. Well, performance when performance is of utmost importance, you always write your own.
Pretty much.
So, I mean, I would love to dive into some of these benchmarks. So you have a ton of benchmarks here in your repo. You give one for a Rails context as well. You know, how does it stack up? Let's say, you know, at Ayush's point, you know, how does it stack up for a Rails app running Puma? Like, how are the benchmarks?
You know, it's been quite a few years since I did the benchmarks. I don't remember what I was using with Rails at the time, whether it was Puma or something else. I didn't see big differences though. The benchmarks were done with a single, well, I guess they were done in a couple different ways, but generally not with most workers, because with workers, then you have to worry about the overhead of the shared data store, which is typically quite a bit higher than what you get from the web servers themselves.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, I keep circling back to the 100,000 requests per second, and kind of like you mentioned, you know, hitting the limitations of Ruby's benchmark because it goes so fast. Can you elaborate kind of on that?
Right. So your test tool has to be faster than what you're testing. So the original or what I was originally using for the Ruby benchmarks wasn't able to keep up with the rate. So I knew I could go, or I knew I could process more data than what the benchmarks were showing. So I tried out my own and was able to get a significant boost in throughput, or measured throughput.
How do you know that? I'm curious. Like, where do you get to your point where you're like I know
If you
this thing
start
can
up,
really.
yeah, if you start up, a web server is kind of unique because it can have requests coming in from multiple sources. So if I started up 2, 3, 4 benchmarking tools and were able to hammer on Algo and see that all 3 of those benchmarking tools were pegged out, then I knew it could handle more than each one of those individually.
Gotcha. And
And that's
what
what I saw.
protocols does this currently support?
HTTP, you mean?
Just like
Web server.
HTTP2?
Oh, no, it's just HTTP and HTTPS.
Okay.
It has not been upgraded to use HTTP2 yet, so it doesn't handle some of the more some of the newer features.
Yep.
And what about WebSockets? I'm guessing if you have GraphQL streaming, as you said, then it supports WebSockets as well, right?
It does support WebSockets, yes.
So it's cool. So what are I'm curious,
Actually,
like the real life how's it handle in production, right? Like are you running this in production? Are you using it for like massive scale yet? How is it faring?
yeah, I have to just rely on the users to tell me that. And as you may be aware, as open source projects typically don't get a lot of feedback except for issues. So you get complaints, but you don't get any of the things that say, "Hey, it's doing great. I like it a lot," or something like that. It's more about issues. Often they start out with, "I really like it, but."
Yeah, I mean, honestly, this is like I love again, it's circling back to GraphQL. Like, I feel like as like I'm torn because on one hand, most Ruby apps are going to be using Rails in some capacity for their data connection, right? And so it would be nice to just like quickly get a GraphQL server up and running in a Rails context. Is it fairly straightforward to like connect all those pieces together and mount this like on its own sub process from Rails or forked process? What is like kind of like that path look like to success?
I haven't done a lot with Rails myself.
Okay.
As you know, it's not a high performance system, so
Right.
I tend to steer away from it. And,
So I'm curious then, if you're not using Rails, what is your like preference for like database in combination with the GraphQL side?
I wrote my own. I have
I mean,
actually, but it's not what I'm using.
I have a feeling that will be the bottleneck, right?
Mostly, quite honestly, I'm doing most of my latest work in Go. But the databases I'm typically using are either Mongo or Redis.
Okay. Do you find that either of those would be like probably most performant alongside of Algo?
It depends what you're trying to build or what you're trying to store. Redis is probably high performance or higher performance, but it's a little bit more restricted in what you can store or how you store it in there. Mongo gives you a lot more flexibility in terms of query capabilities and yeah.
I'll admit it's been a long time since I've used Mongo. I'm curious, since you have experience with that, like how is the pace kept up for Mongo? Is it still like fairly performant?
Oh yeah,
I,
oh
I
definitely.
forget
It's only getting better.
I forget why people decided to switch off of it, to be honest.
Yeah, I don't know why they would. We're still using it quite heavily, and in both in Go and in Ruby. But for Ruby, it's kind of nice because you store everything in JSON. So you
Right.
take your Ruby object, you encode it as JSON, and you store it. You fetch it back,
Yeah, I mean,
unbox it, and you're ready to go.
I remember my first Rails conf. It was wildly popular, definitely amongst Groupon as an example, which is much smaller now. And Living Social used to be a thing. I don't know if they're
Right.
still around, but right. I don't know why Mongo kind of dropped off the Rails and Ruby ecosystems. It's definitely not as prominent, but
Right.
I always liked it because you could just like dump data at it and it could handle it.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, it reminds me. I have a friend that's he loves CouchDB for the same reason. And he's
Right.
just like, relax, just go on the couch.
Just drop it in there.
That's funny. So it's interesting. So I'm curious. Like, then, do you find it kind of like easier to connect GraphQL like typing system because you're using Mongo in those cases because it's so flexible, and I imagine the data structures are similar.
Well, for GraphQL, the way Agoo works is the data structures are just Ruby objects. So yeah, it's easy. It's a Ruby object is easily encoded in JSON, which is easily stored in Mongo, and vice versa. So it
That's
makes it
really
easy to say, so it makes it easy to say, hey, get me all my songs. And you just do a query on the song database in Mongo, and there they are. You pull them back out, and they're already decoded, and your work is done.
Oh, that's really cool. I'm looking at your example now with the artists and everything. Oh, that's really cool.
Yeah.
Oh man, I'm gonna have to play with this more. So I see you have locks in your mutations. I imagine there's a lot of like internals happening in Agoo that requires locking mechanisms.
No, actually, those locks are simply because because you're getting HTTP requests, it allows you to have multiple requests in process at the same time.
Oh, I see.
Now, so while Algo can handle that nicely, the Ruby side of things can't. So it may fire off multiple requests for the same object. So unless you put a lock on the resource, then you're liable to get collisions.
Oh, this is really interesting because one of my biggest complaints of like Rails and like a background queuing processing system is like you have to like load your entire application just to run a worker, which seems like so bizarre to me. Which I know there are like some optimizations that are made right on the constant loading side to help ease the pain of that, which has gotten better, but it's still like not ideal. Does Agoo kind of like help with that? Like, have you had a good experience like with like background workers and Agoo like as an ecosystem?
Coupled with the database, it works great.
Yeah,
you can get very high throughput, and your bottleneck becomes a database, which is kind of what you want. You don't want the bottleneck to be your application. One of the things that I did notice early on was that Rails is great for putting together prototypes and for setting up. I want these windows to display my data. Fantastic. But if you're looking for high performance, down the road, it becomes more and more difficult to get that performance with the with the Rails layers on top of it. So if you can break your application up to have a higher performance backend, and with something that does just the view, making use of Rails, that seems to be a good way to make it work.
So when you're writing web applications with Agoo, do you use any framework, or do you just write like rack code directly for the server?
I don't even use rack.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, so you're like going down a level even further than that then.
Exactly. The only thing I struggle with is, I'm not very good with making pretty UIs and dealing with CSS and that kind of thing. So it'd be nice to have somebody hold my hand on that, which is kind of what Rails does. But
I'm curious I'm curious what your what your bottlenecks were like in Ruby itself, right? Like what kind of when you're trying to test or like hit the limits of the performance, like aside from the GVL, like what like kind of bottlenecks were you hitting just like in the Ruby ecosystem to push things further?
So it's a web server, and the first thing it does after it processes a request and gets on the queue, and it calls into Ruby. After that, I'm kind of hands off. It's whatever the application developer has written that's going to have the impact on the performance. So really, I just care about getting stuff into and getting the results back. So if you've got a large Ruby result and you want to convert that to JSON, that'll take some time. Even with OJ, it's still more overhead than just saying, here's a bunch of text.
Right. So are you not doing any like connection pooling or anything like that to like keep the connection open with, for multiple requests kind of thing?
Oh yeah, it does keep the connection open.
Okay.
And you can set the timeout so that after a minute it'll drop it if there's no activity.
Do you have any examples of like real world usages where you're using Agoo and it solved problems that couldn't be solved in another way?
Yeah, you're asking the wrong person. I wrote the tools.
Fair enough.
I'm curious where like you want to take this to, right? Like I can imagine a whole bunch of use cases for it myself, but do you have any like direction that you plan to continue pushing it to, or?
I don't see pushing it in any particular direction right now. It's kind of stable the way it is. I guess the next step would be Web 2, but I haven't heard anybody really complaining a lot about that. So.
Yeah, I mean, all I can think is people trying to hook this up to Action Cable, or I guess probably any cable at this point.
Yeah, I think the biggest advantage of having HTTP2 support would be just multiplexing, because you can, if you're requesting assets, then you can send multiple assets down the same TCP connection. Whereas with HTTP 1.1, they're all individual requests. So I think for like web application developers like myself, that's been the biggest attraction to HTTP2 is just multiplexing.
Right. And of course, with Agoo, connections are pretty cheap. You could actually open up multiple connections to Agoo and it'll process the requests in parallel. And I have seen some people do that.
Is that process fairly straightforward, just like opening up new connections to it?
Yeah, just open up a new connection.
Open up a new connection.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
your JavaScript code.
the bottleneck that multiplexing solves is more on the client side, because a browser will only, I think, open like 6 to 8 connections at a time. So if you have a vast number of assets that need to be downloaded, that's going to be a client-side bottleneck, which is what multiplexing solves, because it'll just do it over a single TCP connection.
Right. Well, I
Yep.
would think
But
that most machines would have a hard time keeping up with a whole lot more than 6 or 8 connections. So
yeah, exactly. But yeah, that's why I don't know the specifics of how the magic that HTTP2 does, but because it does it over a single connection, it can get all those assets down pretty fast. So that's kind of led to the usage of things like import maps and things like that, where you don't bundle your JavaScript, you have them as like 20, 30 individual files, because suddenly getting multiple files down from the server isn't that expensive anymore.
right, there's still overhead. I think where HTTP2 helps on that is if you don't have, let's say you're downloading large assets, if you're pulling them from storage, there's going to be delay as you're pulling each segment of those. So that lets you interleave it on the same connection. If the server can provide the data fast enough so that there's no delays, then it really doesn't provide any advantage over having multiple connections. I mean, your pipe is only so big.
Yeah, that's true. Exactly. I haven't played haven't played around a massive amount with this stuff myself, so I'm just talking from blog posts that I've read on performance benefits of HTTP2. I'm far from an expert.
Right. Well, and it's also it depends on what the application's doing with the data. You know, if
Exactly.
it's handling all synchronously, then it really doesn't help. But if it can handle it asynchronously, then I could definitely see an advantage there.
Oh, I see you have an example on server sent events.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty cool. Interesting. So I'm curious. We talked a little bit before the show about your heavy Go use. So I'm curious, just from your perspective there, kind of, where do you see like Go as providing more benefit over Ruby in some of these performance, metrics? Like why use a Go over like a Go web server as an example?
Yeah, actually, for the Go version, I actually wrote it with as for the company, and they allowed me to open source it. So it's called Giggle, and it's from UHN GGQL. We just pronounce it Giggle.
That's pretty funny.
But on the other side of that is OJ. There's OJ for Go, and it includes JSON path and quite a bit of others. I guess the reason I've been drifting more toward Go, other than of course I'm using for the company I work with, is it is higher performance, and honestly, it's easier to work with a larger team with it. It's more strongly typed, which helps. It also, because of the way it's set up, it's easier to set up packages and have different teams or different individuals working on different portions of the code, and then bring it all together. So
I see. Yeah, I did like that about. I only did a small amount of Go development, but definitely the typing was very helpful for for people getting up to speed with things quickly, and they just infer the types and know what's in there. Yeah,
sometimes annoying.
Yeah. But I'm curious, like, what about Ruby is limiting for like larger teams like working on the same thing? Is it just like the packaging ecosystem of Go that's more beneficial in that respect?
Yeah, I think Go has a little more. It's a little more structured development environment. So there's a lot of tools that help you, measure coverage, do benchmarks, kind of enforces testing. Um, Ruby is, well, and rightly so. It's a little more freeform. It's great for small projects. I like it if I'm writing something for myself. Well, I work in the U.S. and Canada, so I had a horrible time finding a bookkeeping system that would work. So I wrote my own, and of course I wrote in Ruby. There's no way I was going to attempt that in Go. Ruby is just easier, more fun to work with. It
Yeah,
just doesn't
100%.
scale as nicely with larger teams.
That's fair. Yeah, so I'm curious other details, like maybe if like about OJ specifically. Is there something more performant about OJ and Go over Ruby?
Well, yeah, there's less overhead in creating the objects. I think that's probably the biggest difference. I actually use a similar approach, a single pass parser, uh, to do the parsing, which helps a lot. A lot of tweaking there, trying to figure out. It helps you learn the language a lot when you test out different approaches to solving the problem. The overhead of a function call, the overhead of the number of arguments, the number of return arguments, passing function pointers, all those things come into play.
I gotcha.
Yeah.
So would you say like Ruby objects are bloated in comparison?
No, it's they're different.
More of
Yeah,
the
there's a lot.
mechanisms. I'm just curious. I don't know the
There's
internals well enough.
yeah. So think of C. You can write C code and you can have structs and you can attach functions to them and they kind of look like objects. You got to go and you don't have to do as much work under the covers to make your objects. They same thing though. You've got attributes. The inheritance mechanism's a little, less. I don't like it as much as I do Ruby, but Ruby is much more flexible and much more powerful in terms of inheritance and the way you can embed or include code when you're working. Honestly, it reminds me a lot of Lisp, which was my first serious language. Past BASIC, that is. And Lisp flavors, and nowadays class has a lot of the things that you get in Ruby, and I suspect that's where some of that came from. Is probably looking at Lisp and seeing, oh yeah, that works.
So,
Right.
how does the OJ gem differ from what the built-in JSON parser in Ruby? Is the Ruby one, the one in the standard library, Gina, is that written in Ruby or is that a C extension? Because I know OJ is a C extension, isn't it?
It is, yes. There's the JSON gem. Well, originally it was in Ruby, and then with a C extension. And I think that's still true. I don't know if the Ruby part of it is still there. I think it's all a C extension. But we took different approaches to the problem.
Okay.
So, one of and I've complained about this before. I shouldn't complain, but one of the things that the Ruby gem encourages is monkey patching. So basically, if you want the feature of being able to decode or encode your object, you basically have to modify the class, which means that if somebody else comes along and says, well, I want this other encoding system, oh, and I picked the same names for encode, now we have collisions because you try and monkey patch and one overwrites the other. the approach that I took with OJ was OJ is a separate package. It'll look at any object. You don't have to modify that object to encode it. You basically leave the object alone. It's not yours. Don't mess with it. And that's kind of the approach I took.
Yeah, monkey patching's a bit, it's quite divisive. I'm a fan of it in certain contexts, but I completely see the point you're making there.
Right.
Yeah, I was hopeful that refinements would have fixed all of this. It doesn't quite work the same way.
No, it's a design decision that was made. Once you're down that road, you can't really have it both. Well, you can have it both ways, but some things you can't change.
Yeah, that's one thing I miss from other languages is method overloading, and for this reason,
Right.
Right. It makes it very hard to do it without monkey patching, to be honest.
Right. Yeah, I mean, plug for Lisp and flavors is before and after and whoppers is nice. You could basically say before this gets called, do this, or after it gets called, do that. So you could avoid the monkey patching issue.
This is really cool. All right, so if somebody wants to benchmark their web processes and like do a comparison, like say I have a Sinatra app that I want to swap out Agoo for, what's your recommended path for that? Do you have tools that you use to do tests like that?
Well, yeah, on the web or on my README page for Agoo, you see at the very bottom there's perfor, performance measure, basically, and that's typically what I would use when I'm benchmarking my stuff or trying to make improvements on it, tweak it here, tweak it there. I'll use that to see if I've been successful or not.
Do you prefer that over like Apache Bench or something like that?
Yeah, actually, I don't know if Apache Bench was available when I first wrote this, but there is another tool that escapes me. See if I can recall by looking at this. Yeah, I don't see it right now. There are some other tools out there.
Perfor looks very similar to Apache Bench. I mean, you don't have to do much.
Well, I mean, there's only a certain number of things that you really want to do. So, give a few options for how you control it, the number of workers, number of requests per second, and stuff like that. There's only so many things you really want to do.
I'm interested to know, like, because I see you have lots of middleware set up here to make it easy to snap and plug into this kind of framework. I don't know if you want to call it framework.
But, yeah, I'm not sure what you'd call it.
But so I'm curious, like, because I foresee this as being like something you could quickly just like, hey, like try this out. And we'll show you the benchmarks and performance of using this over something else. Or, is it pretty straightforward to like connect things to the middleware in a way like that, where you can get observability or things like that?
Well, for middleware, it just uses the rack approach.
Okay.
So it's Agoo doesn't have any claim to being a middleware expert on that. It just supports rack.
So can you use this as a rack middleware?
Yeah, as a rack server, yeah.
It's a rack server.
Yeah. Yes. As a matter of fact, some of the examples that do show that. Yeah, and
Oh,
I think it really boils down to when people are trying to build a Ruby application web server. It comes down to, are you going to go Rails? Are you going to use Rack, which is a little more low level? Or are you going to just do it all on your own? And all of them are viable options.
do you recommend using this for like custom sockets?
Explain that in a little more detail.
Sure. Like if I just want to connect on an arbitrary TCP socket or UDP or something like that.
Oh, yeah, it does actually support that. It actually supports a couple different models. So, for example, let's say you have a Rails application and you want it to be able to get data. This is completely contrived. Get data by using GraphQL and hitting some other server somewhere else. Then you could, or even the same one, you could even open up a file descriptor and use that as your socket and
Oh, cool.
exchange data that way. So, you might set up your Agoo as your data store, and you just keep a great big hash map in there. Obviously in memory, so you lose it if it goes down. But you could then connect with a lower level socket than over TCP and get your data that way.
That is super fun. So I'm curious, like, how long has this been out? Like, how long are you working on it? And like, what is, how do you get this out there? Like how does, have you gotten like a good amount of contributors to it? And, is it pretty straightforward to manage at this point? Like it's very so clean written. I'm just curious, like, what your experience is working on it as an open source project.
Generally, what I've seen with the open source projects is you get contributors that want to like fix a bug or identify an issue, but they typically don't get in and say, hey, I want to add this brand new big feature. It's typically just a little bit, you have a spelling mistake, or, it crashes when you look at it backwards. So, I can fix that. But, that's pretty much the extent of contributors so far on the stuff that I've been working on. Yeah, I guess the biggest, and it's not really a complaint, my biggest wish for open source is I wish there was some way of getting feedback from people that are using it, how they're using it, how they like it. But there doesn't really seem to be any nice path to do that. There's a nice path for, here's issues, but there's not a nice path that says, I'm using this, it's working great, or have you tried using it in this way? And it would probably be useful for folks, to see how other people are using different open source packages and see if it fits any of the things that they're trying to do.
Yeah, I have been seeing a recent influx in like open, I don't know what they call it specifically, but basically a lot of repositories will turn on by default like usage analytics and metrics in the libraries, which maybe isn't the best solution to this problem, but
Right, and there's discussions, at least for GitHub anyway, there's a discussion category, and I've seen a little bit of that, less on OJ and Agoo, but more on some of my Go projects. There seems to be a lot more, I don't know, maybe it's just a different kind of crowd that goes to the the different types of languages. I have no idea.
That's funny. Yeah, I'm curious. Like, how do you like discussions? Like, have you found certain value in it over just like issues workflow?
Yeah, I have actually. With the discussion, you don't have that pressure to, oh, I got to fix this bug. It
I
can
see.
be, what do you think about this? And it's like, well, maybe not that. How about something like this instead? And, you get more people involved. So it's, a little more friendly, I guess, or a little more, less pressure.
Less pressure. Yeah, I could see that. Uh,
But having said that, some of the projects, OJ, for example, I've got a couple of folks that contribute fairly regularly, and find a little tweak here, a little tweak there, help make it a little bit better, and that's kind of nice.
so what's the release process look like for something more along the lines of Agoo, where I guess you don't have too much use case uh, specifically yet, but do you foresee that being like maybe a different release process than something like OJ?
No, it's just I try and follow the same release process. I put in I keep a change log and try and follow the standards for that. I branch off of development to make my feature branches, merge them into development. When it's time for release, excuse me, I'll merge into master, tag it, and then do the release. So try to use the same practice across the board.
So I can't help but think, Agoo is the Japanese word for flying fish, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you said you spent some time in Japan yourself. This seems to follow kind of the Ruby pattern I've seen more in Japan, where it's very much less Rails heavy and very much Ruby forward.
Right.
Sinatra definitely, at least years ago when I attended Ruby Kaigi, Sinatra was more of the Rails hype than it was Rails itself, right?
Right.
So do you see like maybe more people from like the source of Ruby, the origins of it, maybe picking up steam more and jumping on maybe Agoo's adoption?
Definitely for OJ and OX, I think there's a bigger following in Japan than there is in the US. I mean, again, this is just based on issues in PR requests,
Right.
but it seems to be more active in Japan. Agoo, hard to say. That seems to be a little more international. It may be that Japan hasn't picked up on GraphQL as much. But again, without that feedback from users, it's kind of hard for me to say. But I do remember, so the name Agoo, I came up with that. My wife and I were taking a vacation on the northern side of Japan and driving along and stopped at the little place, and I like dried fish, so got some dried fish and eating it and thinking about how I was going to do this browser, and that's when it was, oh, Agoo, flying fish, it flies, yeah, it's so fast. So
That's great.
so that's where it came from. The epiphany occurred driving in northern Japan.
So I'm curious too, like just circling back to the GraphQL aspect of this. Does it integrate the full GraphQL spec? Is there anything missing or client library connection wise?
No, as far as I know, it's a full spec.
I'd be
I might have
interested
missed
to
something
know.
somewhere, but yeah, if you find something where it isn't, let me know, and I'll get it in there.
I would love to see benchmarks of this against GraphQL Ruby, because to be honest, it could make a great kind of showcase of, hey, use this over that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I have a link. Web frameworks, the benchmarker. I believe that compares it to just regular Ruby GraphQL.
Oh, okay.
I know that's changed a bit over the years too, so I'm not even sure where everything stands. I know I haven't been updating it with my latest version, so maybe a little bit long in the tooth.
Hey, I'll give it a try.
So all these the open source projects which you run, which is quite a few of them, are they just like hobby projects? Do you take sponsorships from the community, or are they like for businesses that you work for or work with?
They're hobby projects. Yeah. Originally, OJ and OX were for a company, KVH in Japan. Actually, I don't think KVH exists anymore, but I think it was subsumed by somebody else. But otherwise, yeah, just for hobby. I like writing code.
Fair enough.
My relaxing time is I stop working, I sit in front of the TV with my wife and write code.
I love that. Your peaceful time, raking the Japanese sand garden, just pumping out some super performant code.
Well, I do try to get a little bass practice in every once in a while too.
That's awesome. Well, we've talked about a lot here. I'm excited to try out a ton of this stuff and see how easy, GraphQL is working with Agoo, because it definitely that is a great use case for it. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about, before we go to picks here?
Nothing comes to mind. This is kind of a whole new experience to me, so I'm not sure what was expected.
Yeah, I mean, if anything, get people exposure to Agoo and really lower level server stuff, because you don't need you don't need too much to get something out there, and Agoo definitely makes it easy to do, and stick to the basics, really.
Right.
Cool. So we have a segment at the end here where we kind of just pick a couple things, or one thing that could be anything, doesn't have to be code, doesn't have to be anything in particular. Just pick something that you want to share with the world, share with the Ruby community here. Could be anything.
Should have warned me.
We can give you some time. We can give you some time. Ayush, do you have anything you want to share? I can go if you don't.
Yeah, I got a couple of things. One
Sure.
is the TV show Better Call Saul, which I'm binging again for I think the fourth time, which is a prequel to Breaking Bad. It's my favorite TV show of all time. So because I'm binging it, that's forefront of my mind. So that's one of my picks. And the other one is a movie I saw last week on Netflix called Unfrosted, which is made by Jerry Seinfeld, which is the most unbelievably stupid, nonsensical load of bollocks I've ever seen in my life. But it was thoroughly entertaining. It's like one of those movies where have a couple of glasses of wine, throw your brain away, and just switch off and watch it. It is such drivel, but it is so funny. It's far from a good movie, but it's one of those movies that's good because it's so bad.
Oh, that's funny. I'm going to check that out. That sounds great. I guess I can go. I've been playing with a lot of AI stuff, as always lately, and I got I got the Rabbit R1, which there's a lot of flack out there about it, and there are some things that it's not great at, but it does great at transcribing stuff and using it for that purpose and summarizing meetings and things like that. So I am finding like use cases for it. The vision is a little lacking. But I don't know. It's kind of fun. It's an interesting device. So I will plug it. I don't know if it's worth it for everyone, but I'm having fun with it. And the other thing, there is a large language model trainer application where you basically can point a Hugging Face data set at it, and it'll automatically fine-tune a model for you, which is really interesting. So I've been toying around with that and playing with stuff to train and fine-tune some models based on different conversations, which is kind of funny.
Have you been using the new Apple MLX?
I haven't, mostly because I just bought this giant beefy machine.
Okay.
Running GPUs. So I'm running it on GPUs right now. But I am interested to check that out. I only have access to an M2 here, so I don't know how much performance I'll get out of that. But have you messed around with that at all?
Yeah, I've got a Studio. It's an older one, the M1 Ultra. But
okay.
It seems to run just fine.
Nice. Have you run just inference on it, or have you tried tuning stuff?
I've tried tuning. I haven't tried full blown training. That's kind of it's not what it's designed for.
Almost why bother? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. A year from now, it might be done.
Right. That's funny. I'm curious what you use for your inference. Do you use like Llama CPP, or do you have something else?
I have used Llama CPP. Still trying to figure out what's best for what I'm doing for work. The hospitals, we're trying to use that for various applications that I probably can't get into.
Sure. Well, cool. Do you want to share some picks, Peter?
I guess, like, what kind of picks?
Maybe one of the bases on your wall.
Well, this one.
Oh, that is really cool. If you're not seeing this right now, it looks to be a custom travel base.
It actually started out. So I've been taking bass lessons from, actually a guy named Mike McCavin. He was the lead guitarist for Gypsy Rose. But I bought this and told him I was trying to build a travel bass, and he says, "Oh, I've got this old junker here, all kind of busted up." So that became the neck. I cut off the head, made the body, and yeah, you can see behind it. So the strings basically go around, come up here, and go to the tuning, the tuners, so you can adjust it. This here is for sitting on your leg.
That is so cool.
So it's a new bass.
That is unbelievable.
Yeah, if you can't see this, the tuners are at the bottom of the bass, and there's like a leg rest. It's really neat. Pretty inspirational.
The neck comes off so that I can put it in a backpack.
Oh,
Oh,
wow.
that's cool.
What's the wood that the body is made of?
Oh, it's just made of oak.
Okay.
That's beautiful.
It
How
was
long
a
did
fun
it take you to
project.
build that?
Not that long. Off and on over maybe a month or so.
Nice.
So,
Do you have
but
any
I've
plans
got,
to make more bases?
I don't know. I've got the other two of our upright bases that you see on the wall there, and I made those. So there's probably another one somewhere in the future.
That's
I
really
also,
cool.
I also build bicycles, so that's why I can do the metal work as well as the woodwork. So
Nice.
gotta have
Yeah, the
other
simple
hobbies
stuff.
besides
The
just
simple
riding
stuff.
cars.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not even bikes are optimized enough for you.
Yeah, actually, I go the other way on the bikes. I keep it simple, single speed. So.
Love it. Well, Peter, it's great talking to you today. Thank you for sharing your experience and Algo with us. I definitely am going to dive in myself and see how fast I can get things to go. And again, thanks for all the work that you do. Appreciate it.
Love any feedback. Thanks for having me on the show.
And if anybody wants to reach out to you or connect with you on the interwebs, how can they do that?
Email it, peter@ohler.com, ohlar.com.
Fantastic. And so until next time, folks, Valentino is out of here. And thank you for listening.
Cheers.